Okay, good morning. My name is Beata Halicka. I'm professor of contemporary history at the Adam Mickiewicz University in Poznan. I also want to start to say thank you to the organizer, to EUCAnet, for hosting us here. It's a great pleasure to be here, and I'm sure it is going to be a very exciting event again. The first panel, we start with memory politics in a regional perspective. And the important question is towards a new East-West divide question time. It is a panel by the Konrad Adenauer Foundation in Canada, so we are also grateful for the support here. And the idea of this panel is the East-West divide. We have been discussing this topic as one of our topics during our project already many times. But nobody expected that after February 24, it will become a new aspect, a new development also for European memory politics. So because of this, towards the new East-West divide, Piotr Alexi will speak about it in his presentation. But we will also have a kind of comparative perspective. Because Kate Korycki is going to speak about right-wing populism in Poland, the kind of nostalgia, and to compare it, as he said, the Polish right-wing populist could be treated as an incubator or as a kind of inspiration for Canadian right-wing movement today. So it is interesting what kind of comparison he is going to present. And we also have Oliver Schmidtke, who will speak about memory politics in Germany and in Poland. And this is also a very hot topic, as always. But especially last year in the German journal Osteuropa, the Professor Felix Ackermann has published a provocative article with the topic of asymmetry in Polish-German relation. And a 1 or 2 months ago, it was an additional journal in Osteuropa as a discussion to this, what he has provoked. So it is now really last month a lot of discussion between German and Polish scholars, and I'm happy about it because it's important. We keep talking, we keep the dialogue. So this is I'm sure on time. So I will present short our speakers. Each of you have 15 minutes time, and after we will have enough time for discussion. So please think about questions or short comments. It would be really very important to have a discussion after the presentation. As first, we present Kate Korycki. She is an assistant professor in Department of Gender, Sexuality and Women Studies at the Western University in London, Ontario, in Canada. So welcome in Europe. She's a political sociologist interested in ways collective memory creates, justifies and maintains system of social stratification. We are very excited to have her books. It is already almost printed, will be published in Berkan Books in August 23. The title is Weaponizing the Past, Collective Memory and Jews, Poles and Communists in 21st Century Poland. And her new current project, is connected with Canada in the study how Canadians tell the story of the past in school curricula, for example, on the political speech, and what do the stories reveal about the current notion of belonging. So it is a short introduction, and maybe you can start as first, and I will introduce the next speakers later. Please.
Okay, thank you, Beata. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Oliver. Thank you, EuMePo, for gathering us here in this lovely city. And I'm really looking forward to our conversations today and in the days to come. Can everybody hear me well? Okay, great. I think I'm organized. Let me start. As all of you know, collective memory field posits that memories are socially and dialogically constructed. That is, they involve the collective telling of stories more than simply sharing experiences. The field assumes that the process of telling stories is partial. One could call it political, in that it relies on actual historical events, but it selects, orders, and frames those events in ways that serve and reflect the present-day needs of the storytellers. Some call it this presentist process the invention of usable pasts. The usability may concern the articulation of grievances, but in more general term, it always relates to constitution of identity, be it of social movement, political party, or a nation. To share a story, the story goes, is to belong to a group. The telling of stories may be done at any social level, but in this talk, I'll concentrate on the political elites and how they weaponize the past in their electoral politics. So when I was asked to participate in a panel meant to probe potential differences between memory politics in the East and the West, I was prepared to argue for the turn to the right being an ongoing global trend and memory politics being at its core. I was going to argue for sameness rather than difference. But while preparing my remarks, I discovered regional differences. So let me tell you, my findings in brief are that memory politics was central in the lead up to the right-wing populist moment in the East, and memory politics was muted, if present at all, in the lead up to the right-wing populists taking off in the West. In other words, weaponized memory propels right-wing populists into power in the East, and weaponized memory is deployed by right-wing populists while in power in the West. So the sequencing with which memory is used is different, but what causes the right-wing turn is similar, and what constitutes the right-wing turn is also similar. I will first sketch the causes and features and then gallop through the Polish case. I will not get to Canadian case today. So, since 1980s, both the East and the West followed the political-economic path of slow dismantling of the welfare state. This is a well-described process of neoliberalization of the public sphere. Tony Judd's monumental post-war confirms it as a general trend, and even the IMF, ironically, worries about its effects. This neoliberalization has led to deindustrialization, dramatically increased debt levels, and precarization. More generally, our last 40 years is a time of increased risk and anxiety over survivability, relating both to the planet and the individual. Note that when I speak of anxiety, I do not refer to mental health condition, but to structural condition that organizes our lives. So the trend is true both in East and West, even though it may be diagnosed and perceived as a grievance with different intensity in both regions and particular societies. The second aspect of neoliberalization involves a restriction of alternatives or the evacuation of meaning from the public speech. This means that the state of actively produced economic and existential anxiety is not represented or rendered true in political sphere. We pay lip service to acute problems, we look for quick fixes, we fetishize the hoped for technological solutions, we weave tales of progress and all around good news. So on the one hand, we have a constriction of public space with the attendant increase in risk, felt by all in middle classes acutely. This represents the neoliberalizing push to marketization. And on the other hand, we have a concomitant lack of representation of the reality in political speech. This represents a hollowing of democracy as it denies voice to large numbers of people. These two causes produce the anti-liberal push in Hungary, Poland, US, and Canada. They can be thought of as political, economic, and discursive cultural. They occur together, and by doing so, they upset the balancing in which liberalism and democracy actually work. Liberalism and democracy, of course, are contradictory principles, and they only work if they remain in some fine-tuned balance. And this balance has been upset. The beginning of the process occurs as far back as 1970s, speeding up and getting a second wind in 1989, and continuing to this day producing a backlash. The backlash is sometimes turned to the left, like we saw in Spain and Greece, and more often and more visibly, it is turned to the right, as we see in many places in Europe, the Americas, and Asia. To these two trends in many regions, I want to add a third element that is divided by regions. So a liberalizing push in the West. Nancy Fraser called it cheaply progressive neoliberalism, which creates conditions of possibility for politics of moral panics. And second condition actually emerging from communism, which is present in the East, which creates conditions of possibility for politics of mnemonic capital. And I'll talk about it later, about the mnemonic capital. So the Western element, the progressive neoliberalism, concerns an increase in visibility and on occasion access to power of groups hereto denied such access. So this is the liberalizing push, which realizes gains for women, sexual minorities, and racialized groups. The gains among these groups are uneven, they're partial, uncertain, and all have been tenuously secured by prolonged confrontations with the state. Some remain fully unrealized. As partial and as tenuous as they do result in a greater visibility of those who had until recently no universal access to corridors of power. So the weaving of the three strands, the increase in risk, the non-recognition of that reality in public talk, and the elevation of hereto powerless to visibility creates a condition of possibility for skillful right-wing leaders in the West to weave a narrative in which victims of neoliberalism become victims of liberalism. So victims of neoliberalism, of course, exist. We all face increased anxiety and risk and their denial. And the risk is more real in the middle and lower rungs of income ladder, obviously. But the victim of liberalism, that is a victim that is of elevation of power of women and racialized minorities, has to be invented. And in the hands of powerful leaders, think here about Bolsonaro, Le Pen, Trump, and by now the whole of the Republican Party, Poilievre in Canada, that constructed victim is going to be more often than not a white middle-class person, white middle-class male person. That person who feels the increased risk and is given a narrative in which that risk is presented as the loss of status to the supposedly usurping power minorities. And the image of the girly and scared Justin Trudeau, the Prime Minister of Canada, hiding from the manly transformer / freedom-seeking fighter, has all the elements of that construction. So on the one hand, the emergent leaders tap into the discontent that is real, unexpressed and unaddressed. On the other hand, rather than direct the anger and political action to the culprit of receding state and rapacious capitalism, the leaders of such movements mobilize dissent around nostalgic conceptions of heteronormative whiteness. If you doubt this, just look at the Republican Party in the US organizing law and state power against voting rights of mostly Black people, reproductive rights of all women, and existential rights of trans people, all the while calling the protection of such rights cultural Marxism. So far, I covered the causal factors of the emergent turn to the right, and I have begun articulating some constitutive features, so let me just spell them out. We already know from Laclau, Mood, and Bonikowski that populism is a political strategy that rests on the creation of a political boundary between corrupt elites and moral people. We also know that the right-wing populism always involves the manufacturing of either local or foreign threats. This is a politics of moral panics, and those threats act as solutions to problems. In this way, the real uncertainty is given a target and object which has nothing to do with the source of anxiety, but is presented as a source of all evil. This invented threat is thus a way of acknowledging grievance, real or imagined, but more importantly, they divert attention from what is happening. the neoliberalization, which the right-wing populism do not intend to stall. So to finish this theoretical section, let me give you a Twitter version of my arguments so far. And I'm going to use Slavoj Žižek speaking very provocatively and very imprecisely to do this. In 2016, Slavoj Žižek said, "It is not Trump who is the problem, it is Clinton." Before you bristle, let me rephrase and make it precise. Trump was and is an emanation of a real problem. And for the purpose of my talk, he may be thought of as the most powerful representation of the constitutive features of this moment. This is a leader producing enemies to channel real and imagined anger. Clinton, on the other hand, is the most oblivious, unself-conscious representation of causal factors of this movement. So this way of framing the issue allows us to observe that we're seeing a general phenomenon of imbalance between neoliberalization towards market and hallowing of democracy. They have locally inflected expression, but the trend is general. Two, the framing helps to understand that there is a political, economic, structural aspect to it, but there is also a discursive cultural aspect to it. They occur together, they do different work, but they're analytically distinct. And three, the discursive cultural factor turns on a sequence with which memory enters in different settings. So if I were to apply this matrix to Poland, this is what emerges. Every government since 1989 contributed to the erosion of the public sphere. The state shrunk, markets expanded, and the care of the self was privatized. This worked remarkably well for some, perhaps many, but overall it resulted in the increased precarity of life. If market forces rather than universal entitlements organize our belonging, cumulative economic indicators may be growing, but so does individual risk and uncertainty. So this is our political-economic causal factor. This political-economic causal factor was compounded by an absence of recognition and representation of this growing uncertainty in public speech. And this is perhaps not surprising. If governments want to implement austerity measures, they're hardly going to be spending much time pondering, expressing, and representing the harms that austerity brings. So in Poland, the diversionary speech they engaged in was supplied by a prolonged remembering or indeed condemning and concerning themselves with the communist past. So in an attempt to understand the Polish scene, this is a shameless plug to the book that's coming out, I came to think of it as a politics of mnemonic capital. In doing so, I followed Pierre Bourdieu and proposed that political parties that emerge from the fog of communism, this is right in 1989, have unequal access to necessary resources or capitals to be political parties. On the one hand, we have a political loser, that is a former communist party, who has the material resources to be a functioning party. They have the experience, the know-how, the networks to create identities, to formulate programs, to mobilize support. The loser, therefore, has what Bourdieu would call access to material and cultural capital required to be a party. On the other hand, we have a transitional winner. Think this is a group or movement, like a former oppositionist, think of Solidarity, who have none of these necessary resources. They know how to be a movement, not a political party, two different beasts. They have none of the, they don't have the money at first, nor the organizational structures, nor the expertise of formulating platforms, mobilizing votes, or achieving political identity through platforms. So what I propose the winner has and the loser does not is access to symbolic, or what I call mnemonic capital, of having won a moral victory or being on the right side of history. And I don't want to make a banal claim that one party wins and one party loses. What I'm saying is that the winner uses the fact that they won a moral victory in their political campaigning. So the party in power since 2015, I'm going back in time, the Law and Justice Party, is definitionally turned to the past, mnemonic warrior, Bernard, who we call them, and it paints communists as essentially anti-Polish. I can, in the Q&A, talk about it, how they do this by conflating communism with Jewishness. It has, since 2019, expanded its repertoire to include a threat of gender ideology. Thus, it moved from not only fight over mnemonic capital, but also a moral panic flight. So now they're kind of, the East and West resemble each other. The party in power for 8 years prior to that, this is the Civic Platform, or the PO party, this is winner number 2, talk of communism covertly as they praised market as freedom. If one were to read PO platforms, and I have, one gets an impression that it was written by a computer in the UK and then badly translated to Polish. So I call this strange narrative an inversion of meaning, in which one says one thing and means quite another. So I'll give you some example. The party styled itself as uninterested in the past. They needed to do this to appear different than the peace. But it peppered the program with phrases like catching up from backwardness, safeguarding the gaze of transition, protecting freedom, all of which were intelligible only in reference to the past and to the communism. Indeed, PO never mentions communism directly, but it places it as a dark background against which it projects its goodness. Second, the freedom invoked in the program a lot represents at once an allusion to anti-communist dissident, but also signals a fundamental shift in understanding of the term. Not freedom from want, as it was understood by communism and solidarity, not freedom from political voicelessness, as it was understood by solidarity and dissidents, but only market freedom. Third, the inversion concerns the content of the program, titled Future Poland for the People, in which there are no citizens, no public sphere, no universal entitlement and obligation, only market segments, laws of supply and demand, rankings, brands, innovation, and productivity. One of the most telling examples was a market segment called seniors. The priorities for the seniors, and I paraphrase, were to ensure active, independent, and satisfying life, as well as access to good quality healthcare and increased participation in social and public life. Nobody would disagree with any of this. But the actual solution of running seniors self-directed afternoon programs in community centers seemed far removed from the expressed ideal and far from the daily reality of failing the healthcare system, increased reliance on family for survival needs, exorbitant costs of medication, diminishing public transit infrastructure, etc. Thus, the PO program seems to be full of disguised memory and short on solution. This is hope for the here and now. The harsh judgment is not ideological but analytical. It has to do with the perversion of democratic principle that the PO seems to valiantly defend and subvert all at once. The SLD, the post-communist party, also ended up narrating the past, but I will skip it in the interest of time. All this to say that all three participants, major participants in the Polish scene, the groupings of them, narrated the past for political ends, and they all produced historical narratives for public consumption. And they all referred to it, overtly or not, to the communism. In turning to the memory and away from the here and now, they limited democratic speech as their policies made life more precarious. The regime of the peace is the direct result of the turn to memory. To bring my talk to a close and return to my causes, in 2006, Tony Judd published his monumental History of Europe, the Post-War. Two ambitions motivated the book. The first was to overcome the Cold War way of writing history, in which East and West emerged as hostile and foreign opposites. The second was to recover the social democratic ideal of Europe, which by the time of his writing was slipping away. In 1945, Judd claimed, all of Europe in its different regimes embarked on a massive anti-fascist project of social democratic welfare state. Judging by our surprise at the reemergence of the powerful right, It seems that the lessons from the past need relearning, and that they actually may hold some answers. Thank you.
No, you go, but do you stand or?
So
okay, right.
would you like to come here and just take my seat?
Yes, Kate, thank you very much. It was a great starting point for us and introduction to the topics, because as I know, Piotr will continue with the historical turn. Yes, so it is very well, I think. Let me introduce Dr. Piotr Alexy. He's assistant professor on the Department of Eastern European History at the Adam Mickiewicz University in Poznan, so he's both from Poznan. He's the author of 2 monographs about unrecognized states, Transnistria, and also published a book about small region in northwestern Poland, and received a Young Turk Prize in 2022 for this book. But he's also a scholar, author of many articles, and also publicist, collaborating with leading Polish and international journals. His scholarly expertise focus on collective identity, dynamics, and identity policy in Central and Eastern Europe after the collapse of Soviet Union, and also on international relations in the region. And Piotr is involved in this our Monnet project, European memory politics. So please, the floor is yours.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you, Kate, for your extremely interesting speech, and I think that it will be dialogic with me. And funny case is that we are speaking about the regional perspective and the East-West divide, and the regional perspective is a Polish perspective. So Poland is a case study for the region, for the Central Europe. But no worry, I will bring up Hungary on the stage as well. Yes, as well. And so Kate said a lot about memory politics in Poland and how it works. I think I will be maybe some more specific in some questions. That is why, yeah. So the issue of memory started to play a significant role in Polish politics, political life, and public life about around year 2000. Yes, around the year 2000, and after that it became one of the main axes of the social and political polarization in the following years. At the same time, that issue became one of the main determinants of our attitude toward our Eastern and Western neighbors. Polish history and memory cause that in the area of identity and politics, we are separating ourselves from Russia, and it is obvious for us, let's say. Saying us, of course, I use yes, but what is the most interesting, the dispute over our own history has become very closely intertwined with the discussion of our relation with Western Europe, with Western partners from the European Union. And I will try to explain how it happens, and yes, and maybe try to give an answer for the question of the new East-West divide now. About the memory turn in Polish public life in the year 2000. Why it happens not then? Why we can speak about the memory turn in the Polish public life, and why about 2000? So the first reason is more internal and specific. So there are 2 internal and specific reasons. The first one is that in the year 1999, the archives of the communist regime were opened, and then the discussion of our past, our communist past, and its influence on the current politics began. Yeah, and the second one is the second reason is the opening of the discussion of Polish attitudes towards Jews during World War II. The discussion was initiated then by a book, The Neighbors, written by Professor Jan Tomasz Gross, and it was about the massacre in village Jedwabne, that Polish civilians, people do that massacre on the Jewish civilian inhabitants. And the second type of reason is more general, and it's related to Poland's entry into NATO into 1999 and in the EU in the 2004. It is said that Poles recognized then that they had already secured their future, so they must put their past in the order. Yes, so thus the process of adapting Polish memory culture into the challenges of modern times began around 2000. Before that, during the time of socialist rule, real discussion over the past was frozen by political censorship. Then, in the 90s, public opinion was focused primarily on the development and economic issues. So there was no space for the discussion about the past. In 2004, Poland joined the European Union, so supranational community, in which there was also a process of forming of a common memory culture. In other words, the internal dispute over the nature of the national community and how to understand its place in history was component by the need to fuse it with a supranational memory culture. In this time, two currents of attitudes towards Poland's past have emerged in public life. The first, which I call critical, prioritize the desire to uncover the white spots in the nation's history and openness to discussion of crimes or infamous actions committed by its members. For the second current, which can be described as patriotic, memory and history were primarily the foundation of national identity, which had to be, in their view, rebuilt after the social era and protected in the face of social and civilizational changes. And it was the representatives of the critical current who aroused great interest in the past and brought that issue in the memory issue of the memory into public life. But soon the new right-wing forces made the patriotic current one of the most important political fuels for them. Defending the dignity of the nation and the positive image of Polish history became one of the key elements of the narrative of the right wing, primarily focused around Law and Justice Party. It should be said that this new right-wing historical policy was born from a combination of a political plan and authentic grassroots public emotions, really. It was one of the cornerstones of Lech Kaczynski's victory in the 2005 presidential elections and the victory of the Law and Justice Party in the same year in the parliamentary elections. So after another victory for Law and Justice Party in 2015, because between 2007 and 2015, the PO was ruling. After another election, Warsaw entered into a dispute with the European Commission over the rule of law. It was caused by the reform of the judiciary system in Poland, and this resulted in the development of the anti-EU and anti-Western rhetoric. In the narrative of law and justice activists, the EU has become a real threat to the Polish national identity due to its liberal, anti-national, and extremely secular character. The issue of memory and identity has clearly been incorporated into a political motivated dispute, triggered by the desire to capture the judiciary system. Nevertheless, this attitude also has deeper causes. The first would be the peculiar sacralization of independence that is strongly abandoned in the patriotic current of Polish memory culture. In this case, the EU is seen as a force that constrains the will of the nation, supposedly represented by the ruling party, and thus limit sovereignty. The second would be the belief that in Poland's dire geopolitical position and the historical trauma associated with it. I will turn to this topic later. And the third cause will be this disillusionment that a large part of the Polish right has felt as a result of getting to know the West. Sorry, I have a little allergy that makes me dry in the mouth, and that is why it's hard to pronounce some words. So the last phenomenon was described by the Ivan Krastev and Stephen Holmes in their book The Light That Failed, A Reckoning. They said that the anti-communist opposition that took over the role of souls in Poland in the late 80s often came from the Catholic, patriotic or even nationalistic circles. For historical reasons, there was at that time in Central Europe, there was that conviction that nationalism and liberalism were complementary. Yes, were complementary. In contrast, that view was quite opposite in the West. In the 90s, with the war in Balkans, ethno-nationalism was not accepted in the Western Europe. According to Krastev and Holmes, this suppressed sincerity about the role of national feelings in Central Europe. The European Union, dominated by German vision of dealing with the problem of nationalism, promotes a post-national civic patriotism. So for some Central European elites who were raised in the traditional patriotism, it was reminiscent of Soviet identity politics. Moreover, for former oppositionists wanting to break Poland out of the Eastern Bloc in the 80s, they shared a specific image of the West, but that image was outdated already in the 90s. As Krastev and Holmes write, from the point of view of the conservative Poles in the Cold War era, Western societies were, I quote it, were normal because unlike societies in the communist system, they valued tradition and belief in God. In the meantime, however, it has become apparent that the West is already secularized, promotes multiculturalism, requires openness to refugees, and treats ethnic nationalism as unacceptable. For the Polish right, the internal dispute over history and the question of defending the dignity of the Polish nation have became identical to the question of its own subjectivity vis-à-vis Western Europe. It is worth recalling that after 2004, a major tension emerged in the discussion of over the European memory culture between the new and the old members of the European Union. Yes? The former raised the issue of the lack of recognition of trauma of the region associated with the Soviet terror. Yes? The later, the old members, yes, on the other hand, accused Eastern and Central Europeans of depreciating the Holocaust by trying to put an equal sign between Soviet and Nazi terror. So, and now we are in 2023, yes? So the Russian aggression against Ukraine has probably caused significant changes in the international order and a revision of the foreign policy approach of many European political formations. There is a widespread belief that the effect of Russian aggression is to consolidate the West. In the first few months, in the international press and in statements by experts, there was an expectation that the existing dispute in the disputes in European Union would recede into the background. Poland is pursuing a policy of support for Ukraine in the social, political, and military spheres, trying to mobilize Western partners to increase their involvement. In this context, it may be surprising that Warsaw has not revised its confrontational stance towards the European Union. Moreover, the ruling party, the ruling right-wing camp has decided to make demands to Germany to settle reparation for the World War II damage. In that peculiar moment, it seems strange, yes, but it's not. Russian aggression against Ukraine has stirred up a past trauma in Poles, paradoxically giving the national right new arguments in its criticism of the West. Russian-German cooperation in recent decades, most notably the construction of the Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2 gas pipelines, as well as German restraint on the issue of military aid to support to Ukraine, led them, the Polish right-wing forces, led to the narrative eagerly comparing that situation, to the repeat of Molotov Pact and the beginning of the World War II. So, in last few weeks, in Politico, there was an interesting article written by Matthew Dua and James Townsend. They said what they wrote. They said most Central and Eastern European countries are experiencing an "I told you so" moment, yeah? And that is very visible in Poland. From the perspective of many citizens and much of the political class, history and foreign policy merged into one in 2000 after the Russian aggression. So we are repeating histories, and the narrative on the history is the same as the narrative of the foreign policy. In Poland and many other countries in the region, we can observe growing impression of greater subjectivity, especially in their relations with the Western European partners. I told you so moment, it is that. Yeah? This would indicate that we are doomed to deepening divisions between East and West. Yeah? However, it seems to me that the image is not so clear, because we observe serious changes in the rhetoric of Western leaders. Yes? The turnout in the Eastern politics of in Germany, for example, and a few weeks ago, Emmanuel Macron, who was associated in Central and Eastern Europe with a characteristic for France distance from the region, said during his speech in Bratislava, "We didn't listen enough to you and your calls for your history and painful memories to be acknowledged." Yes, so at this point, of course, it is difficult to say whether President Macron's words mark a real turnaround in French policy towards the region, or are the result of memory of the momentary emotion just. Yes, nevertheless, it is a clear signal of some changing trends. And the European Political Community Summit, which began in Moldova the day after Macron's speech, a clear difference was drawn between France and Germany on the issue of security guarantees for Ukraine. Yeah? And surprisingly, it was France that seemed to encourage its partners to be more decisive on the issue. Germany positioned itself as a break. So can we speak of an East-West divide in the EU now? Yeah? I think there is no better place to ask this question than in Budapest. Yes. So does Hungary policy toward Russian invasion of on Ukraine position the country in the east or in the west. Where is Poland? Then where is Germany? And where is the United States? Yeah? Where is east in the west in that question? My point is that in this moment we see many significant divisions in Europe. Divisions over attitudes toward liberal democracy and the rule of law have dominated our view of European politics in a previous year. But new issues are now emerging. Question of supporting for Ukraine, EU and NATO enlargement, security policy and strategic autonomy of Europe. After all, the division on fiscal and economic issues has not disappeared. So if we draw a map with a lines, borders, defined by all those divisions, the picture would be very more complicated than the simple East-West division. Yes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pierre. Okay, before we start the discussion, I am sure there are already some questions or comments, but let us give the floor to Oliver Schmidtke. I was thinking if I need to introduce Oliver Schmidtke, but still we have some guests who probably don't know Oliver in person or didn't meet him before, so let me introduce Professor Oliver Schmidtke, the director of the Center for Global Studies at the University of Victoria in Canada. He was also former Jean Monnet Chair for European History and Politics at the Department of History and Political Science at the UB. Oliver is author of many books, 14 books as author and editor, over 18 articles of scholarly journals and volumes. He serves also as leader of the Canada-wide research group for the Canada-Europe Transatlantic Dialogue Project, organizing comparative transatlantic research in the field of migration and citizenship studies. He's leading our Jean Monnet project, European Memory Politics, and we enjoyed it very much to be led by you, and also very curious about your presentation. Please.
Thank you very much. Before I set off, maybe just a quick note that this panel has been sponsored by one of those who support our network, and in particular the students touring Europe at the moment, the Konrad Adenauer Foundation. So they help to bring you here, and also you sharing the experience of a scholarly conference. So I hope you endure the, with us in 2 or 3 days, and you'll see how hard scholars actually work, when they go to conferences. But 2 more things before I start off with my title here. It sounds a bit pompous, I understand, right? Because it's broad strokes. But what I try to do is here to show you, and that's, it follows up from what we just heard, at how historical narrative provides, if you want, a discursive space in which political preferences are articulated, in which norms, principles, a notion of who we are as a collective are being negotiated. And while it is fascinating, and that has been part of our network, to think how the Russian attack on Ukraine has changed the geopolitical reality of the continent, and how over time, the I told you so, that was our last conference in Poland, where our Eastern European partners said, look, we've been talking about the Russian threat for ages, and you wouldn't listen, right? The Germans built another pipeline, right, to cooperate. Yeah, so there's a change dynamic, right? And I'm not sure this is the best depiction of this kind of struggle East-West, but there's a new dynamic. What I want to do today, however, is focus more on the issue of democracy. And Piotr, in his last comments, alluded to this, right? There has been quite a bit of struggle. Those of you in the room who live here, all about it, but more for the students. The state of democracy and the state of the independence of the judiciary have been a major issue of dispute between Poland, Hungary, and the European Union. That said, look, how you organize the control of political power through your judiciary, media independence, doesn't conform to the principles that we have at the European Union, what we expect from liberal democracy. Right? And so what I try to do, and it's very broad strokes, but I hope you see how I try to do this empirically, because there's easily the danger of falling into some form of cultural essentialism. I guess, we have those countries, that are deeply, ingrained in a particular legacy of cultural values. So I try to stay away from this and do this with the help of an analysis of elite discourse. And I think Piotr spoke a little bit, and both with Kate as well in the beginning, how important it is how the political elites of countries use these narratives and relate them to contemporary political realities, mobilize them, weaponize them was your term of the upcoming book, right? And so that is, in a way, what I try to do here. And one last, it's never a good paper if I have too many, introductory remarks, but I think it's, you can see, for the sake of making an argument, right? I play with this distinction between two sets of models or cases. Whereas here, as you will see, and I think we all agree, if you look around the continent, the rise of populism, authoritarian threat to democracy is definitely not restricted to Central Eastern Europe. It is all over Europe, right? It comes in different forms and in different political guises, but essentially it is a universal, unfortunately, European and / North American phenomenon, right? So take it with a grain of salt, but I hope I can show you, thinking as a social scientist, right? How can you get to this broad thing here? Narrative, historical narratives, the past, interpretation of the past, shape our contemporary ideas. How can you do this empirically? How can you, in a way, measure this, right? How do you reconstruct these narratives? Well, that's what I try to do. I just take you back, and we just heard this, to 2004, 2007, Eastern enlargement. Great enthusiasm across the continent. In Poland, it was like, we returned to Europe. It was probably a similar rhetoric here in Hungary as well, right? We belong to Europe, to Western Europe this is, and communism was a phase in history that artificially divided the continent, and our cultural roots are in Western Europe. Great degree of euphoria. And, you could ask, how much is actually left? But I'm always struck by this. When you see these surveys, that was done 22, so very recently. And you can see here, support for the European Union is very strong, in particular in Poland. Like 90% of the people want to, think the European Union is a good thing, but also hungry. But then you have a political elite that, as you will hear in a second, has embarked on a sometimes very aggressive anti-European rhetoric, right? With pictures almost, I think the Polish president even compared the European Union to the Fourth Reich, where basically Germany uses the European Union to take over Poland, right, through the back door, right? So a very aggressive anti-European stand, and then you still have last of the population still being very sympathetic to it. But I leave this here and then gradually go into the narratives that are being used to also support the skeptical European perspective. So what I'm concerned about is the backsliding that we've seen and an authoritarian threat to democracy. Again, not restricted to Central European Union, but we see at the moment that certain countries are more closer to giving in, right, these pillars of democracy. Think about the Pen presidency in France, or think about what's happened in Italy. So not at all exclusively here, but we see trends along those lines. But this gives you a pause, at least. The two countries that have been part of our EU network, with partners in Hungary and Poland, a clear decline in the quality of democratic life. You can see here, this is the Freedom House. I measured this. You can be skeptical about how you do this, but essentially there is a clear trend, right? What we consider often as constitutive for liberal democracy, freedom of press, independence of the judiciary, parliamentary oversight, all those things are increasingly under threat. Across Europe, I would argue, but in particular in these two countries, one of those things. Now, how are now collective memory and democracy related? Very briefly, let me sketch this. One thing is essentially, what do we learn from the past? How do we narrate the past to learn from it? In particular, with respect to democracy. Think about the 20th century. We had the rise of authoritarian regime, fascist regime, communist regimes, and they have basically almost eradicated what we today perceive to be liberal democracy across the continent. So the reflection on what went wrong has been highly informative also of how post-1945 democracies have been built. And my case study in Germany, the whole constitution is built around how do we account for why Weimar failed and what can we do to prevent this, right? So many provisions to rebuild the democracy were in a way rooted in the collective experience of the fascist regime, right? So learning from it and political principles rooted in this. So what do we learn from history and how do we interpret something like the tragic first part of the 20th century or going into later periods as well with fascist rule and then communist rule in great parts of Europe. So that's one. The other link between collective memory and democracy is to see who tells the story. And we've taken these students now to sites, that a state commemorates and tells a story about what national identity is and all this, but we've also seen examples of memory activists, right, challenging dominant narratives. And in my view, confronting the past from different perspectives, also having the room to contest official narratives, having civil society be involved is a critical component of a democratic culture. So the openness for contention. And you can see here, you might have heard about the Spanish parliament just said, we support civil society groups to look for those who were murdered by and then hidden and buried by the fascist regime in Spain. This is an example of giving civil society the mandate to, in a way, inquire and also do, come up with different and also competing interpretations of the past. That's a sign of maturity for democracy. Think about the Canadian context of indigenous legacies, right? Yeah. So who tells the story and who's involved? The other one is here, the German was very big in Germany, but also elsewhere. Think where you stand. Local communities, local groups trying to, in a way, tell the story from a local perspective. So what happened, not the rise of fascism, but what happened in my town, what happened in my community, right? These kind of things. Right, now conceptually, you see where I'm coming from. Maybe I skipped this one, but I think, or maybe that one reflection. Over the course of the past 4 years in the network, I think one thing that we realized is how deep these narratives are that shape national identities and shape the perspective of the political. The beauty of our network was to be able to compare those. And so, I think, Piotr, you mentioned it, sometimes the Westerners, we know exactly what's happening in the East or the other way around. Lots of prejudice. The need to listen actually to these narratives and understanding how they shape emotions, how they shape loyalties is very important. Otherwise, you don't really understand how politicians can use them and also how different competing political actors could actually try to retell their stories or based on it. So this fundamental sense, what connects us as a community is connected to how we tell our past and the historical narratives that we mobilize. All right. These are just some examples that I found because you could now, looking at the East-West divide democracy, you could look at survey data. I just give you a couple from Pew Research Center 2018. Maybe it gives us a first indication of differences. Like this is, I'm not sure you can read this, national identity is somewhat important. Oh, let's see. More likely, so it is ancestry. How important is first ancestry to your national identity? You see somewhat of a cluster of Central Eastern European countries here, the births, right? The birth into the nation, not so much the citizenship that you have, but rather the being born into a community. Stronger emphasis here in the East than in the West. Oh, the Portuguese seem to be an outlier here. Here you see attitudes, right? I think that was partly, this is opposition to gay marriage. In terms of social orientation, there seemed to be a strong divide, East-West divide. Right? If you look, that's quite clear. You can explain this, with legacies, with, role of the church and so forth, right? I just go through those quickly because that's not really my topic. Here, and that goes closer now to what I want to do, national identity and democracy. Eastern Europeans are more likely to regard that culture as superior to others, but not really, right? If you look at the map, you don't have a clear East-West divide, right? There's slightly more, but if you go to the south, the notion of our culture is superior to others, can be found not exclusively at all in Central Eastern Europe. But that's an indicator of, if you think about more extreme or exclusionary forms of nationalism, that is the material they work with in terms of their historical narratives. Now I come to my own little study that I did that is based on political elite discourse. So we've heard about peace. What I did was to look at basically iterations, programmatic statements, public talks, parliamentary debates of political elites, and it's since 2015, so in Poland it's peace, and in Germany it's various governments, looking at how they look at history. And the first one is only what is being brought up. No interpretation, just what do they remember in their public statements. What is notable here is that surely the Third Reich is still an important reference point, both in Germany and in Poland, right, in terms of describing the 20th century past and its relevance for today. When politicians bring up the past, they often come up with a story and then they tie it into what they try to achieve today. What is quite, I think we briefly discussed this with a group here already, the Holocaust doesn't have such a central feature in Polish collective memory. And that's something actually for communist state. I don't have time to explain this in full detail, but in the communist legacy, fascism was more a fight between classes, right? And in a way, communist state no longer saw themselves in the legacy of being responsible for the Holocaust. So that was done by other societies, and they liberated it. And through the revolution, it was far more important to underline the class structure and the working class having defeated capitalist society. So a very different narrative. So the Holocaust plays a far bigger role. No surprise, right? In German society, trying to come to grips as a perpetrator country, right? What happened there? That's an important part. The memory of communism is far bigger here in, not here, but in Central Eastern Europe, in Poland, right, than it is in Germany. Interestingly enough, although Germany was divided and had a communist part as well, it hasn't really entered public discourse so much, right, the memory of communism in this respect. And then there's already quite a distinct legacy of commemorating European integration in Germany as compared to Poland, but that's clear. Poland's relatively recent new member state. Germany's political fate has been tied to European integration since the 1950s. Now I come to, how much time do I have left?
Just 2 minutes, 3 minutes.
Okay. Matt told me, his advice to grad students, always have an exit strategy for your talks, right? So you can easily get out. So this is now, the interpretive part, really the interesting part when he starts, but here we go. So how is it being framed, right? The first one, and I'd be very, what you see dominant in the Polish context, and that builds on, not too surprising what we heard. It's not actually very strong ethno-cultural coding of national identity in the past, but it is built on the theme of continuously being the victim in history and Poland's dramatic past of being divided between the big powers of Europe, Russia and Germany most notably, right? So also religion Catholicism is often referenced in terms of fighting communism, right? In the end, overcoming communism. So it is part of the cultural identity of the country. It's part of, we have in a way survived history. We've been resilient, and that is due to us being Polish, right? So it's not in the narrow sense an ethnic description, but more one deeply rooted in history, in a dramatic history of this country. But what you've seen with peace, and I think you already started, and we heard this from Kate as well, a strong emphasis on external threats, right? And now think about Russia, you know, the trauma of being divided in the first part of the 20th century between Russia, Soviet Union, and Germany comes back, right? And what nationalists often do is having a very vivid and threatening image of those dangers that lie out there. Right? Our existence is under continuous threat, and we need to react to this. And you can see also now why European belonging is not so strong. In Germany, the whole idea of rebuilding democracy is intimately tied to being a European country and taking over the Western models and so forth. In Poland, it's rather this, in Poland, you understand, it's a current political elite, right? It is a depiction of, you know, we are taken over yet again by a foreign power, right? For us to persevere in history, we need to stick together. We need to also, in a way, guard, you know, we need to defend the nation, that's one. Defend the good name of Poland. And you could see here, if you have a very dramatic account of external threats and of the external enemy, you can also turn this around internally and, for example, and we don't have time to go there, tell your scientists, we don't want to hear about Poles being somewhat complicit in the Holocaust, right? We want to have a very clear sense of pride of Poland because that is what we need to do to survive, right? That's the narrative. And so then you could depict those who tell a different story as traitors. Remember civil society being able to challenge also state narratives. I think there's been a shrinking space for civil society actors in Poland to come up with competing narratives of the national past. So what's interesting in Germany, maybe one thing is that you have also the rise of an extreme right party, the AfD, the Alternative for Germany. And for the first time really since the Second World War, there is a political party that tries to rewrite history. They call it a history of shame. Auschwitz shouldn't be the center of German collective memory, right? And so it's not by accident that the far right goes straight to the dominant form of how Germany and its elites narrate the history of the country and the political principles that come with it, right? So interestingly enough, now you can see the chance of the president speak more to history in a more urgent sense of protecting tolerance, protecting, fighting antisemitism and racism. So a politicization of historical narratives in Germany in light of a rise of an extreme right. So one thing I still wanted to do. 1 minute. Oh yeah, I was afraid of this. So the last one. Okay, this is my real point. I study populism. And what you see in the historical narratives, if you think about democracy, in the Polish case, is a strong emphasis on a form of popular sovereignty that defends, in a way, the nation, its identity and its strength, and is not rooted in the kinds of right-based liberal democracy. Rather, if you have too many actors, right, engaged in this, if it's too, if political power is not centered in the hands of some who defend the nation, it is often seen as weakness. And you hear this in Hungary, you hear this in Poland. Liberal democracy is a sign of weakness, right? You don't have a strong leader, you don't defend the interest of the nation. And it's a fundamentally different concept of democracy to say we actually need to, in a way, create this homogeneous entity as a nation, defend its pride, and that is what independence and freedom is all about. And you understand, given the Polish history, that the priority is often on protecting us from outside interference. And it has an implication for democracy in terms of how much dissent, how much plurality, it allows, right? In Germany, trying to learn the lessons has moved very strongly in terms of a right-based liberal democracy in this respect. So that is in a way my fundamental argument. Maybe you can read it here. So I'm co-hosting this, so I take the liberty of taking 1 more minute. What you can see here is, in a way, my main argument is that there are competing interpretations of democracy, and they're deeply rooted in these historical narratives. Like, on the one hand, the need to defend the nation, unity, no dissent, right? Don't weaken the national community, and on the other hand, more strongly emphasizing liberal rights. Okay, with this I yield. Thank you.